Hill versus Colorado case.
The Hill v. Colorado case was argued to violate the First Amendment, which is the freedom of speech.
Leila Hill and other sidewalk counselors argued against abortion rights. This wouldn't have been a problem since they were protected under the First Amendment of free speech, but unfairly, these people stood right outside of the healthcare clinic in order to scrutinize the women entering. This wasn't the first and only incident. Colorado officials noticed frequent and somewhat violent protests outside of abortion clinics, and in response to these unjust actions, they created a new law. This law stated that protesters within 100 feet of healthcare facilities couldn't interact within 8 feet of another person without consent for their purpose of protest, education, giving them literature, or counseling.
Hill, along with many other protesters, believed that this is a clear violation of the First Amendment, or the right to free speech and the right to peacefully assemble. Other members of this party agree that this is a clear violation of the First Amendment. Justices Scalia and Thomas argued protecting citizens from unwanted speech is not a compelling state interest, meaning he believed that damage from the violation of the freedom of speech is far more important than extensive protection in many public areas from unwanted speech. Some argue it also deprives citizens of one of the few non-violent ways pro-life people can convey their message and their viewpoints on the topic.
The other side, Colorado, argued the women had the right of protection from all the hideous comments and harassment they endured, and this legislation's primary interest is to protect citizens entering or exiting a medical facility from unwanted communication, as they are already going through a hard time and need some space. It also doesn't prevent patients from being talked to entirely, but rather better allows them to avoid situations in which they don't want to listen to the message of speakers. Even though the Constitution grants speakers the right to persuade, that cannot extend to unwilling listeners because citizens also have the right to be left alone. The majority also agree that it is content neutral because it does not regulate certain speech, just certain arenas of speech. No matter what message was trying to be conveyed, the law would apply. It is also in concurrence with the Ward v. Rock against racism restrictions because it only limits one channel of communication, not speech overall. This is a compromise as people aren't being stripped of their right to freedom of speech or implied right to be left alone as patients get the space they need and speakers are able to continue to convince, yell, and hold up signs as long as they are more than 8 feet away from the patients entering and exiting the health facilities. Overall, it is helpful to already vulnerable patients walking to and from healthcare clinics.
The Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 favor of the new legislation. They believe this was not a violation of free speech, and instead it is very helpful in protecting citizens that are simply seeking health care. They decided limiting protest, education, or distribution of literature or counseling within 8 feet of a person entering a health care facility is constitutional, and women deserve these basic rights. They had to stay 8 feet away from any patient entering the facility if they didn't acquire consent. Hill still had her free speech, but they also had to give space to patients who deserve privacy.
The right to free speech was argued and ultimately deemed unbroken by the Colorado's law against public protests outside of abortion clinics. The implications of the immense reach of this case has caused many others to come out with other social injustices. Many of these cases have then reached the Supreme Court as well. The McCullen and Coakley case of recent times brings up very similar issues as the Hill v. Colorado case.
Bibliography.